Hi, everyone. Good afternoon or morning or evening, wherever in the world you all are. I'm Quilt Alliance Project Manager, Emma Parker, and I am so excited to welcome you to this episode of Textile Talks, which is hosted this week by the Quilt Alliance. I think all of you, or most of you, know that Textile Talks is a weekly series presented in partnership by the 5 nonprofit textile organizations and museums across the country, whose logos you just saw, but with audiences around the world. Since we got started in April 2020, we have presented a variety of programming for our faithful and enthusiastic audience. In 2021, we had 26,000 people watch all of our talks. So far in 2022, the number is already more than 11,000 viewers. So we're excited to have many of our friends here. Our YouTube recordings now have over 152,000 views. So if you've missed any of our past, I think it's 104 talks, you can check them out on YouTube. We'll put a link in the chat for that YouTube playlist so you can see any of them that you may not have yet seen. Before we get started, I have a couple quick housekeeping notes. As you already have started doing, please leave a chat in the chat box if you'd like to comment or say hello to other attendees. You can send your chat to everyone or just to panelists. So if you want to talk to other folks who are also on the call, just make sure you select that option. We will have a few minutes for questions at the end. So if you have a question for our speaker, Laura Hopper, please do put it in the Q&A box. We do remind you to be courteous in the chat box the very same way that you would be at an in-person event, which I know won't be a problem. You can also toggle live transcript captions on and off by clicking the CC or live captions button, or by going into your meeting settings if you're on a phone or tablet. Depending on what kind of device you're on, this might require you to go out of the meeting and into the Zoom app to toggle with the settings, but it is possible to turn them on or off as desired. Today's presentation does have a couple video clips that have varying volume, so you might want to be ready to turn your computer up and down if you need to, or grab a pair of headphones if you've got some nearby. If you can't hear the video as well, we will link to versions you can watch online after the presentation, but we've done our very best to have the best sound possible for you guys. We are super excited to have Laura Hopper join us in a minute to talk about her work curating the 2022 Quilt Alliance virtual exhibition. I'm going to welcome her shortly and turn the mic over to her. But first, I'm going to back up a little bit. For those of you who don't know about us and our work, the Quilt Alliance is a 29-year-old nonprofit organization whose mission is to document, preserve, and share the stories of quilts and their makers. We're a virtual organization with members from across the United States and the world, and our headquarters are here in North Carolina. Since 2011, our biggest annual fundraiser was an event called Quilters Take Manhattan, or QTM. It was a multi-day event featuring speakers, classes, a trip to a Broadway show with other quilters. We took a tour of the Met Museum's textile space and lots more events. We had the event for many years at the Fashion Institute of Technology, and we always had quilts made or owned by the people who were speaking available to see in person, because that's what's fun about talking about quilts is you get to see them. In 2018, we took a couple years off from Manhattan to do some other fundraising and outreach efforts. But in March of 2020, we were so excited to be returning to Manhattan when COVID-19 forced us to cancel the in-person event scheduled for September of 2020. So we instead pivoted to a virtual event that year called Quilters Take a Moment instead of Quilters Take Manhattan. We are already a virtual organization and have been since our start, and we knew that we had an audience all over the world, but one thing we were really disappointed to leave behind were our plans for a big in-person quilt exhibition. So we developed our first virtual exhibition called Known and Unknown, which is available for Quilters Take Manhattan attendees. We built this exhibit in Quilt Alliance style, focusing on the stories behind those quilts when we knew the stories. And each quilt featured a Go Tell It interview with the maker, curator, or collector of the quilt, so you could hear the story of the quilt from someone who was very close to it. In 2021, we had Quilters Take a Moment again with another great lineup. I hope some of you joined us for that event. And we had another amazing virtual exhibition that was just for attendees called Warm Remembrances. And these exhibits are now both open to the public, so I hope you'll check them out. Laura's going to talk a little bit more about both of them. But I'm especially excited that this year we're having Quilters Take a Moment again. It'll be in September. It'll be a virtual event, and we have way more content spread over 3 days. We have amazing workshops, we have add-on events, we're having panel conversations, and the theme this year is sustainability stories. And just like the past 2 years of the event, we are going to have a virtual exhibition, but it's not limited to attendees. Anyone can visit us, visit the exhibit online. But we hope that if the exhibit piques your interest, you'll also join us for the main QTM event. And I'm going to mention a way you can join us for free. At the end of this hour, we'll be giving away some tickets, so do stick around for that. All of our virtual exhibitions have been made possible by an amazing resource that we happen to have on our board, Laura Hopper. Laura is a multi-talented writer, curator, and quilter that we're so lucky to have as a board member. She works as a freelance quilt and textile writer, as well as creative operations manager for Susie Quilts. Laura has also worked for a number of museums and publications, and we are so excited to have her curate these 3 exhibits for us. I'm going to let her talk a little bit about her approach to this year's exhibition and her approach to curating virtual quilt exhibitions in general. So please welcome now Laura Hopper. All right.
And thank you to the Textile Talk organizers for having me here today to give you all an exclusive preview of the latest Quilt Alliance virtual exhibition, which is focused on sustainability in quilting. This exhibit is part of this year's Quilt Alliance virtual event, Quilters Take a Moment, which, like Emma mentioned, is also focused on sustainability this year. A little background about me. I am a quilter. The quilt on this slide is one of my quilts that was recently shown at the National Quilt Museum, but I'm also trained as a historian and a museum curator. I worked for 15 years as a curator specializing in textiles. Most recently, I was the curator of an academic museum with a focus on Southeast Asian textiles before beginning a career in the quilt industry in 2018. Since then, I've worked for Craft Industry Alliance, Quilt Folk Magazine, and I currently work as the creative operations manager for Susie Quilts. I still work as an independent curator and collections professional, and in addition to working on exhibitions for the Quilt Alliance, I'm currently a consultant on an NEH textile preservation project at a local university. And most importantly, in my heart, I'm proud to be a Quilt Alliance board member. The Quilt Alliance is a vital organization in our community. The grassroots efforts that the Alliance has led for nearly 30 years to save the stories of quilters before they fade away positions not only quilts, but also quilters in the important place in history where we belong. Through our oral history project, Quilters Save Our Stories, and our video project, Go Tell It, you too can preserve your story as a quilter for future generations. This year, we're excited to launch our 3rd virtual exhibition in early July. The exhibition coincides with the Quilters Take a Moment event, but unlike previous years, like Emma mentioned, it will be available to anyone before the event, to sort of give you a little taste of what's to come. Our first virtual exhibit was in 2020, the year that all organizations had to figure out how to pivot from in-person to virtual events. This is actually me at my last in-person quilt exhibit that I've done because everything's been virtual for so long. Our team, which was myself, Quilt Alliance Executive Director Amy Milne, and Project Manager Emma Parker, were already working on an in-person exhibit at the time. Instead of talking about hanging hardware for quilts and printing labels, we had to switch gears and envision a new website and a new viewer experience. Thanks to Emma, who builds our exhibit websites each year, we're able to create an expanded experience that includes Go Tell It videos from quiltmakers, collectors, and curators, as well as interpretive labels, further resources, and high-resolution quilt images. So all things that we wouldn't be able to offer at an in-person exhibit. For each exhibit, you can view the galleries by the sections that divide up the exhibit's content, or you can scroll through each quilt individually. And on each quilt's page is a Go Tell It video, photos, labels, and those further resources. Known and Unknown was our first virtual exhibit. It explored the ways that quilt documentation enriches what we know about quilts and quilt history. What do we gain when quilts are documented, and what do we learn and lose when they're not? Here's just one of our Go Tell It videos from the Known and Unknown exhibit featuring collector Julie Silber. And just as a reminder, the audio might be a little low, so please turn on headphones if you're wearing them.
Hi.
Hi, Laura. Sorry, I think when you muted your audio, it turned off. Jill's here, so could you unmute?
Let's start that over.
Hi, I'm Julie Silber, and I'm here to tell you a story about this quilt for the exhibition Known and Unknown. One of the things we always want to know about quilts, old quilts that we get without any history, is who made it. There are women who signed their quilts, sometimes subtly, sometimes not so subtly, sometimes in the quilting, various ways that women and a few men signed their quilts. The quilt I'm about to show you its history is not entirely unknown, because the quilt maker had the foresight and the strength of ego to let us know a lot about her quilt. That's all embroidered. That tells us who made the quilt. By Mary Lowcock, September the 16th, 1892, Powersville, Missouri. Thank you, Mary Lowcock. You're shouting your name, but you gave us so much information, and that makes a quilt historian and collector very happy. There are so many wonderful things and vignettes about this quilt. You can see them as you see them. We see so much floral work and birds, and there's an owl and pansies and somebody playing a French horn. Over here, embroidered, it says Dreams of the Forest. There's one more homily up here, Home Sweet Home. And as I was looking at the quilt, over here in this block, almost hidden, are three initials, SCL. In looking up the genealogy of Mary Lowcock, I discovered that she had a sister, and her sister's name was Sarah. So Mary made a quilt, let us know in a big way about herself, and then kind of put her sister over there in the corner. You make up the rest. Enjoy the quilt. Look it over. There's so much to be seen and such beautiful, beautiful work. Purple chickens, herons, various colored chickens, a horse. The things she saw around her and appreciated, I would love to have known Mary Lowcock. I bet she took up the whole room.
Mary Lowcock's quilt, with its whimsical dreams of the forest and possible environmental inspiration, is not only an excellent example of what we can learn when a name is included on a quilt, it's also a stunning example of how the wonder of nature works its way into quilts visually. We'd like to invite you to view all three of our virtual exhibitions this summer. And if you'd like to see more of Known and Unknown, you can take a screenshot of this slide, and the link will also be in the chat. Warm Remembrances was our second virtual exhibition and focused on how memory is connected to quilt making, from the ways we infuse our memories into quilts to quilts that were used to mark memorable occasions or moments in history. Here's a video from Zach Foster about a quilt that was included in Warm Remembrances. Zach is also moderating a panel at this year's QTM called Sustainable Stitching, Making Quilts with the Earth in Mind. Zach's video is particularly quiet, so make sure you've got those headphones turned up.
Hi, I'm Zach Foster, and this is a quilt story for Quilters Take a Moment. What you see here on the wall behind me is one of my more recent memory quilts for a woman named Claire, who lives here in Brooklyn. And she said, you know what, Zach, my partner Teddy is turning 40 in a little bit. Could you make him a quilt with all this fabric from his family? I said, sure, no problem. So she sends me stuff from all over the country, and we put it in this quilt together. For example, we started with the center here. She already had these 2 quilt blocks, so I cut them in half, put half and half together to symbolize their recent marriage, the union. And then moving off from there, I know based on conversations with Claire that all the seersucker here is Ted's dad, and this is an old pillowcase, and this is an old nightie that she would wear. There's even here some grease-stained jumpsuit material from one of Teddy's uncles who served in Vietnam. So there are a lot of stories with this particular piece. Table linens from their wedding, all kinds of stuff. And since there were so many stories, and not one person knew them all, because they came from so many different sources, I wanted to make sure the story stayed with the quote. So I did this. I call it a swatch panel. You can see here there's a grid of the fabrics on the front and a little pocket right beside it. If you take out the piece of cloth from that pocket, you'll see a legend, a key to the stories behind all of these pieces. So the stories stay with the quilts. And I'm so glad I did that because one thing I'll always think about this quilt, when I think about the power of quilts, and what they signify, is that Claire, I knew from the beginning, Claire had been diagnosed with cancer. And she had her good days and she had her rough days. I was so excited on the day that I finished this piece. I texted her a picture. I didn't hear back right away, which is a little unusual. She's usually pretty quick on the draw. Heard back that night. She said, Zach, it's beautiful. I'm not doing so hot right now. Can you text a picture of this to Teddy so he can have it for his birthday? I said, sure, Claire, no problem. And I did that. Teddy was very thankful, thought it was real nice. A couple of days later, Claire passes away. And I'm so thankful that I got to hear those stories that she had about her fabric, about her piece, that she got to see this quilt top, and that I got to make this quilt. And I think that as makers, as quilters, y'all know the power of quilts. Y'all know they come from the heart. And sometimes we just got to sit with it for a little bit. You know, I told Teddy this quilt was ready, but it's just too soon. It's too raw. It's only been a few months. So I'm just holding on to this quilt for when the time's right. You know, not all quilt stories are happy stories, but they all mean something. And I hope this story meant something to you too. Thank you very much. Hi,
It's hard to think of other physical objects that carry as much meaning and memory as a quilt can. Zach is well known for using clothing and other recycled materials in his quilts and for the thought and care he puts into his work. I love these 2 videos too because they demonstrate the way that we have been curating sustainable quilts and environmentally inspired quilts into our exhibits for the past 2 years already. And here's the link to the Warm Remembrances website, which will be in the chat as well. So the theme of this year's Quilters Take a Moment is sustainability stories. We take a very broad view of sustainability as being important not only for the environment, but also to us as quilters and as people. How do we prioritize the environment in our quilting practices, but also how do we sustain our creativity and our connections as people during tumultuous times? While quilters in the past may not have used the word sustainable to describe their quilts, since that word has only recently become widely used, quilters have still used sustainable practices throughout history. Here are 3 historic examples of sustainable quilts, starting with this crib quilt that's almost over 300 years old, but looks like it could have been made today. Next is a crazy quilt, which is often pointed to as the epitome of sustainable quilting in the past, including different types of fabric, as well as memorable scraps that are important to people. These quilts were at the height of their popularity around the time this quilt was made in 1889 by Mary Willard, who was the mother of Women's Christian Temperance Union President Frances Willard. Last, we have this scrappy postage stamp quilt that may be familiar to those of you who watched the Textile Talk on Hopi quilts. If you haven't seen that talk, it's available on YouTube now. So throughout history, these quilters have infused sustainability into their practices, creating with scraps in an attempt to not let anything go to waste. Now more than ever, sustainable quilt making practices from quilters and especially the quilt industry matter as we learn more about the dangers of climate change. But it's also important for us as quilters to sustain our creativity and work and to sustain ourselves as people. That's why this year's QTM is so timely, relevant, and important, featuring topics including giving historic quilts a second life, making quilts with the earth in mind, and sustaining a creative business. There's something for everyone at this year's QTM. Our exhibit opens before the event, and today you'll get a sneak peek at 4 of the quilts featured in the exhibit and hear directly from the quilt makers in their Go Tell It interviews. First is Carson Converse with her quilt Ghosts.
Hi, my name is Carson Converse. I'm telling this quilt story for a Quilt Alliance virtual exhibition in conjunction with the 2022 Quilters Take enrollment event. The quilt behind me is Ghost. It is the first in a series of quilts that I call Collaboration with Unknown Maker. For this series, I start with a found quilt, a quilt that has been separated from its history. And I study that quilt and then determine how to proceed in a collaborative manner to create a new quilt that either uses the existing quilt within that quilt or is created in response to the quilt. And a lot of that depends on the condition of the quilt. In this case, the quilt behind me was a temperance quilt that was quite brightly colored, beautiful yellow, red, lilac, light pink. However, it was in really poor condition. And so in this case, I decided that I would actually cover this quilt up with new fabric and use the quilt as batting, following a tradition of using more textiles for quilt batting. However, I did not want to hide the quilt. I wanted to make sure the quilt was still an integral part of the design of this new collaborative quilt. And so I chose a white whole cloth quilt as the final representation of this collaboration. The stitching is matchstick stitching using a thread to match, and it's linear, horizontal linear, with some alternating widths of stitching to create some texture. And it's a typical pattern that I might use in my work. This piece hangs in my living room, and I've really enjoyed living with this piece because of the way that that process of using the white fabric and the matchstick quilting has given a life to this quilt. It changes as the light changes. So sometimes I see this quilt and it just looks like white with this linear texture. Other times it looks more like what you see behind me, where the original quilt is more visible, where you can see things like the shredding fabric here. You can see things like the batting and the binding edge, which was wearing, and there's little strings that come off of it. You can see the original quilt lines, the hand-stitched diagonal quilt lines as shadow marks. And then other times the light hits it in a much more focused way, and there'll be some little detail that comes out. Sometimes I've never seen this detail before. It's just you catch the light just right, and the quilt reveals another detail or lesson to me. And in that sense, I'm so grateful to have had the opportunity to work with this quilt and to get to live with this quilt. I really feel like there's something, a part of the original maker that is here still teaching me and being my mentor. Hi.
There we go. In these pictures, you can see the original quilt complete with its damage. The colors appear more vibrant and you get much more of a sense that it's a vintage quilt based on its fabrics. With the translucent covering and Carson's signature quilting, the quilt has a more subdued and modern appearance, connecting it through time to today. She's given this damaged historic quilt a new and elegant life. I have a very small and modest collection of quilts that I own, made by quilters I admire, and one of those is Carson. In this piece, which I have, it's a very small sample size here. You can see that she makes very subtle adjustments to her thread in the top line of the horizontal quilting that gives her quilts a lot of very modern visual interest. Next, we're going to hear from Youngmin Lee.
Hello, everybody. I'm Youngmin Lee. I'm happy to share my jogakbo, remnants of memory, with you today. Bojagi is a wrapping cloth that covers, carries, wraps, and stores things, not only objects, but also book, happiness. Jogakbo is a result of fabric recycling. People try to save small pieces from making garments and beddings. When they have saved enough amount, then they create something useful, practical, and beautiful at the same time. Jogakbo also is believed to carry happiness and good wishes for recipients or users. Slow hand stitching can imbue good intention to jogakbo, and I believe my jogakbo carries my wishes for happiness too. I found indigo dyed cotton and rami, safflower dyed materials at the antique store in Korea. And I had a feeling these fabrics are initiating conversation with me about time and the memories they carried over. So I decided to create something using these materials, and I dyed some more materials. When I have enough amount of fabric, then I started making jogakbo using samsol technique. Samsol technique is one of the distinctive and very traditional jogakbo making technique, and oftentimes it is used to construct single layer bojagi. I love to make my jogakbo using hand stitching, and this slow process is giving me a peace of mind, and it gives me meditative effects. And my creative process is...
Oh, apologies.
And my creative process is very organic and spontaneous. I often start to putting two pieces together, and that's the start of my making process. As I put pieces together, then I make decisions and my bojagi grows. Sometimes I feel my bojagi grows by itself, as if it has its own will. And I enjoy unexpected result from that process. And I hope you can experience that process sometime too. Thank you.
Jungmann's quilts are often in conversation with nature, sometimes photographed beautifully outside, and are created with natural hand dyes. And the memories and meaning that are infused in her work help to sustain quiltmaking as a medium full of power and promise. Next is an example of a pieced work that's included in our virtual exhibit, but that would be a challenge to exhibit in person. Let's hear from Catherine Owens.
Hi, my name is Kat Owens, and this is the story of the minke whale. I'm a researcher, and I research plastic pollution. But I'm also an artist. In the last few years, I've been making these portraits of animals out of the kind of film plastic that is difficult or impossible to recycle. During COVID, all of my research was shut down. And it got me thinking about the way we tell stories, and particularly the way we tell the story of plastic pollution. You may know that 95% of plastic packaging globally is not recycled, and 90.5% of all plastic ever made has never been recycled. But when you read the literature in the scientific community, they often characterize this as a problem that's really happening in the developing world. They'll talk about the 10 worst polluted countries or the 10 dirtiest rivers. And these are inevitably in South Asia and Southeast Asia. But where I live in the United States, I throw my trash away, and really, in the best case scenario, it's going to be incinerated or put in a landfill, both of which cause problems for the environment. So to my mind, it's not that we've really solved the problem in the United States, but that we're better at hiding the problem. So I'm working on a series of portraits of 46 animals that are harmed by plastic pollution. And to make it interesting, they're all life-size. So the minke whale is 18 feet long and 7 feet tall. Any of the larger projects, kind of over 18 feet, I do with the public. So I took the minke whale around last summer to camps and schools and public events to get the public to help me work on it. I'm currently about 3/4 of the way through the project. I'm just about to finish the 60-foot-long sperm whale. And up next is the 53-foot-long bowhead whale. Thank you for letting me share my story with you.
One thing I love about Catherine's process is that she uses her quilts, a familiar, comforting object, to educate her collaborators and students about something hard and dangerous, plastics. She also invites people who help to create her life-size quilts to sign a piece of the back, which is a lovely touch that helps to not only document her quilt, but also sustain the practice of quilt making for younger generations. And last, we're going to watch this Go Tell It video by artist Millicent Kennedy.
Hello, my name is Millicent Kennedy. I'm going to be telling you about my work, Obsolescence Landline, that's in the Quilting Alliance Sustainability Exhibition. This work was made in 2021 by myself and is part of an ongoing series that takes broken consumer goods and takes them apart and quilts them into fabric using a modified version of trapunto quilting. The first item that I actually used in this series was a broken pencil sharpener. So the thing I was the most invested in at the beginning of this series was things that were broken that we wouldn't try and necessarily fix. And it just happened by chance that a lot of them turned out to be things that have been replaced by smartphones and tablets now. So this work, particularly Landline, I think really resonates with kind of the change in technology that we've seen in just the past, 30 years. And I was really interested in working with these as kind of sculptural materials. They get kind of modified when you see them through textiles, and that they're kind of mirroring labor that happened previously. All of these things were touched by many people to be made, and they are kind of in this burial shrouding process. and being touched by hand by another person. So I'm really interested in that and what kind of becomes a fossilized version of the work. They have kind of a feeling of something that is being uncovered and is maybe excavated. So yeah, that's a little bit about my work and my process. Yeah, thank you.
Millicent's Obsolescence series is one of the most exciting ongoing quilt projects happening right now. She's shrouded in quilted objects like a boombox, unidentifiable keys, and a computer mouse, all things that were once heavily in use and eventually inevitably end up in the garbage. She's also quilted box fans for her Control project and more objects that have languished with people in What We Kept. I also own a piece by Millicent, which I'd love to show you so you can see the 3D nature of her work even more. Holding it up in the tiny little box where I'm talking to. This is a small piece, butterfly hair clip, which meant a lot to me as somebody who wore these a lot as a child. It's a very, very popular way to do your hair when I was in middle school. But became obsolete to me as an adult, which is one thing that drew me to this when it became available for sale. What's interesting is since I bought this, my 2-year-old daughter has become obsessed with wearing butterfly clips. So we have them all over our house and they've taken on a new importance again. So, you know, sort of says something about the cyclical nature of some of these objects. So these are just a few of the quilts you'll see in Sustaining Threads, connecting sustainability in our quilts and our environment. Make sure to follow the Quilt Alliance on social media and sign up for our newsletter to be notified of the exhibit launch next month. And if you're feeling inspired yourself after watching these, you can record your own sustainability story for our Go Tell It series. The link will be in the chat, and let's watch a community sustainability story that was submitted by Rianne Dollar next.
Hello, my name is Rihanna from Kick-Ass Quilts, and I'm telling the story of my first scrap quilt for the Sustainability Stories of Quilt Alliance. I chose to talk about this quilt, first because it's the first quilt I ever made that's big, but also because this quilt taught me two things. It is that everybody can quilt, because I made this amazingly fun looking thing without much experience, but it also showed me that everybody can quilt with any kind of materials. Because I've always been a stubborn person who wanted to try and see if you could do things in a different way. So when I started my quilting career as a student, very stubborn, I heard from people that you can only do it with cotton fabrics you buy in the shop. But I was like, I want to know if that's actually true, because who knows? I wanted to try working with like the most stretchiest, shiniest, ripplest fabric I could find. So I went to Facebook, to those giveaway groups, and I said, who has odd fabrics to me? I think that's literally the words I used in Dutch. And who has odd fabric scraps I can use? And I got a lot of them, like the velvety stuff, the shiny stuff. And I used all of it in a quilt to prove that you can indeed quilt with it. I also got some fabrics from my mom from leftover projects because I learned from her. And yeah, so all of it are scraps. And what I like about it is that it gives the quilt a very lively look, but it also makes the quilt very interesting to touch. Because instead of having like a uniform feeling, when you go over the quilt, your fingers will touch different kind of textures on different kind of patches of fabric. And I think I sometimes have problems with fear and anxiety, and having a quilt that's interesting always helps to calm me down. So that's also why it's partly because of sustainability that I quilt with any kind of fabric, because I don't want it to throw away. I want everything that's there to be reused in a quilt, but also partly because it's very good for mental health to make quilts like this. Because if you open up the floor to quilt with any kind of fabrics, you also open up the floor for the opportunity of having a memory quilt with whatever you wanted to remember. If you have, for example, an aunt who only wore polyester, you can quilt with it. So that's the story of my first scrap quilt. I wanted to share it with you because it still makes me calm and happy to look at it. I still feel proud that I made something like this with my own hands. And it also shows the magic of quilting. Like partly the mental health, because it calms me down. The connection, because I collected fabrics from many different people. The joy, because you can use any kind of fabric you want, even gold. And also the sustainability aspect. It shows you that you can quilt with anything you want. So with Kick-Ass Quilts, my slogan is society's trash will be our treasure. And this quilt is a very good example of that. Thank you.
Her enthusiasm for quilting and sustainability and the way she connects her sustainable quilt to mental health is contagious, and I fell in love with this video immediately when I saw it. And I'd love to see some new sustainability stories from you all soon. So last, I've also pulled together a short list of some of my favorite books about sustainability as it relates to quilting, taking the same broad view of sustainability relating to the environment, quilters, and quilts. I'll go through these relatively quickly, so be ready to take screenshots, or you can rewatch this when the link is live on YouTube. So there's 10 books that we're gonna zoom through. The first is a brand new exhibition catalog, so it should be relatively easy to find. It's called The Woven Child, about the work of Louise Bourgeois, who often used her quilting and patchwork in interesting ways to help her through some significant struggles in her life. Next, Soft Covers for Hard Times, Quiltmaking in the Great Depression is one of my very favorite quilt history books by Mary Kay Waldvogel. This one could be a little challenging to find. If you are looking for out of print quilt books, my best suggestion is to start with your local library and ask a librarian if it's available in interlibrary loan. If not, then you can call any local used bookstore and see if they can help you find this for you to own. Next is Unconventional and Unexpected American Quilts Below the Radar, 1950 to 2000. This is by collector Rod Kirikoff. This book has just been reissued in a second edition, so this is widely available right now. Feed Sacks, The Colorful History of a Frugal Fabric is by Lindsay Cole McCrae, and it's one of the most beautiful quilt books that I own. The photographs of her vast collection of feed sack material is just thumbing through this book is a delight. She talks about quilts as well as garments in this book. Next is another Roderick Kirikoff book called Cloth and Comfort, Pieces of Women's Lives from Their Quilts and Diaries. I included this one because it is a really small, compact book that is full of firsthand accounts of what quilts mean to people and quilters throughout history. It's a really fun quilt book to thumb through. Quilts of Southwest China, which is edited by Marcia McDowell and several other collaborators actually, is a very interesting book. It's highly focused on the Southwest area of China and a lot of interesting research that is going on there. What I like about this book is how they discuss transitions between traditionally created fabrics and mass manufactured fabrics. This is would be probably a challenging book to find. Who'd have thought it? This is a book by the collector Eli Leon. Eli Leon had a large collection of quilts made by African-American quilt makers. It's been recently donated to a museum in Berkeley after his death, and there will be an exhibit of those quilts in 2024. I'm hoping that there will be an accompanying catalog or website for people who aren't able to travel there. So if you can't find this book, then, relatively soon, you'll be able to get some more information on these quilts from the exhibit that's coming up. Resilient Stitch, Wellbeing and Connection in Textile Art is by Claire Wellesley Smith. And this is a great book. It's a combination of stories about the ways that quilters and quilt makers and sewers in general, sewists, have used textile arts to demonstrate their resiliency from a lot of challenges, and the way that it can help with mental health and physical health too. It also has instructions for making some of your own textile pieces in it. Every Last Piece by Lynn Harris is an instructional book. So this is, if you want to start making your own scrappy quilts, this is my favorite place to start. And last is a new zine, which was published by Quilt Alliance President Frances Dowell. Issue 1 came out earlier this year and is all entirely focused on sustainable quilt making. She's a very skilled writer who connects sustainability in quilt making with building community, with quilt documentation, and so much more. And this is available on her Etsy page. So now I'm going to turn it over to Emma for some questions. So let us know in the Q&A box if you have any, and then we'll do a fun giveaway.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Laura. We have a couple quick questions for you, and I'm curious if you could just start, Laura, by talking a little bit about your process of curating an event like this. Where do you start, and how do you kind of conceive, the world of sustainability in particular, but any of the topics that we've done, quilt making and memory making, or known and unknown sort of stories behind quilts, or quilts that have no story that's immediately obvious. Those are huge topics, right? You could pick almost any quilt and it could have a connection to those topics. So where do you start, and how do you find, a lot of the quilt makers featured are sort of new, up and coming, younger quilt makers, not exclusively. Some of them are hundreds of years old. Not the quilts, not the quilt makers. Although that too, maybe, we don't know. So I'm curious, where do you find works, and how do you go about starting when you start an exhibition?
Sure. In this particular case for this year's exhibit, one of the things that I tried to think about is, this is the third time that we're doing this. How can I make this year's fresh? So one of the things I considered is works that would be challenging for us to interpret in the space that we would typically host an in-person exhibit, whether it's because of their size, like the Minky Whale quilt, or their materials, like Millicent's obsolescence piece, which, we wouldn't really be able to hang particularly easily on the types of hardware that's available. So, that sort of helped to coalesce a lot of the quilts that are in the show this year. And certainly, the initial list that I started with had a lot of just monumentally sized quilts, quilts that are just made out of all kinds of unusual things. But, in general, most exhibits begin with what's called a big idea. So this is a curatorial term that basically means your thesis statement. So what you want to develop is a cohesive and brief sort of elevator speech for what your idea for this particular exhibit is. For Warm Remembrances, that one is a great example of an exhibit that was very sort of philosophical. Is sort of where the big idea ended up taking me. We originally thought of this Warm Remembrances exhibit from last year as something that would include quilts that marked occasions. And that's fine, but there are a lot of exhibits that have done that before. So I started challenging myself, well, how can this be a little a little different. And so that led me to start researching memory itself, like how humans form memories, that there are different types of memories, like flashbulb memory is something that happens when you go through a traumatic event. It led me to learn about things like how unreliable our memories can be. And so a lot of the quilts that were selected for that exhibit would relate to these broader concepts of memory making, not just commemorating memory. And then, once you have your big idea and you start doing object selection, generally what you start to do is create exhibit sections, which sort of help to make an exhibit more easy to digest. So if you've never noticed this when you're at a museum before, you will now. There's generally really big labels when a new exhibit section starts, and that's to sort of subtly indicate to you that there's sort of a shift in the narrative. One of the things that I do towards the end is sequence quilts. So I go through and I try and decide, like, what is the story and the sort of emotional and intellectual journey that I want to take people on, and how can I best do that by, putting these in an order that makes sense for people to carry them along. So those are sort of the three big pillars of the process: is the big idea, coming up with your exhibit sections, and then sequencing your quilts into something that is, a good experience, a good viewer and visitor experience.
Yeah, I've learned a lot working with you on the exhibitions about an exhibition as a narrative, and kind of moving through, starting from the big idea and moving through sections in a way that feels like you're learning as you go, kind of, and that you see quilts in opposition to each other. I can't remember, I know one of our past exhibitions, there were two quilts next to each other, and I was like, they're a perfect mirror image of each other, kind of. And I don't know that I would have noticed that if we hadn't been talking about sequencing and story and that kind of thing. So
yeah, I think a lot of people, when they visit museums, the goal is for this to be sort of effortless.
If it's done well, it's almost invisible, but yeah.
Yes, the goal is for, people to be sort of, so inspired by what they're seeing that they don't see the work that we put into it. But, generally that means that there tends to sort of be an overarching view for people who don't know or have any experience with museums, that a lot of these choices are just made for aesthetic purposes. And in some cases that's true, but as a historian, that's not true for me. For me, the interpretation and the story and the narrative are the top priority in any exhibit.
We have just a couple more minutes, but I have one other question, which is, so in all of the exhibitions we've done, each quilt is accompanied by a Go Tell It video. And Go Tell It, for those of you who don't know, is one of our oral history projects. It's one person talking about one quilt for up to 3 minutes. Anyone can make and submit a Go Tell It video. So I encourage you, for sure, especially if you have a quilt relating to sustainability and however you define that. You can submit your own Go Tell It video, quiltalliance.org/GTI-DIY. We'll put a link in the chat. But I'm curious what having a video in particular, I mean, we have a ton of photos, and hearing from the artists themselves adds to an exhibition. Why have those Go Tell It's with each exhibit item?
Yeah, I wish that every exhibit everywhere could have these types of videos in relation to objects. Oftentimes as curators, we're trained in how to interpret objects if we don't have the context or the provenance, which is the object history, to be able to do it very specifically. So we know how to do that. But hearing directly from the person who made it or the person who collected it, really helps to create a personal connection to an object, which is incredibly helpful. A lot of times, one of the things that I would often prioritize in exhibits that I've done in the past is, how can I make all of these objects and all of these themes as relatable as possible to our visitors who, may be learning about Hmong people from Laos for the very first time. Well, why is this important to you and your community in Illinois? So, hearing directly from people sort of activates part of your empathy that doesn't exist when you only just see an object, and you might look at that and interpret it and internalize it as this is a beautiful object, but maybe hearing somebody's story about a baby carrier that was made by their mother before the Vietnam War, and how that was worn as they tried to cross the Mekong River to safety into Thailand, like that touches your heart, that makes history tangible, and it touches your heart, and it makes you empathize and relate to it a lot more. It also helps you remember it more. So it sort of gives history a life that is really exciting to me as a curator.
I think we say so often, God, if this quilt could talk. And it's a chance, not necessarily for the quilt to talk, but when we have a quilt artist, I have recorded more than 600 go-tellets with quilters, and the mass weight of all those stories is something that has really changed me and affected me in a lot of ways. So I'm so excited that we've been able to pair our project with your amazingly selected works. So thanks. Yeah. So I just have a few more things to say, and then we're going to give away 2 tickets to Quilters Take a Moment. If you are interested in stories behind quilts, and if you yourself, or if you've been considering what it means to make sustainably in a lot of different ways, not just sustainability for the earth, but also making quilts in a way that's sustainable for our bodies. It can be really hard on your body. There's a lot of repetitive motion, and also sustaining our creativity. I think you will love Quilters Take a Moment this year. This is just a quick preview of what is happening at this event. We have 3 spotlight QSOS interviews. QSOS is our flagship oral history project. So these 3 quilters, Carla Hemlock, Tula Pink, and Jennifer Sampu, will be interviewed, and their interviews will be archived at the Library of Congress. So it's a chance to see quilt history being made right then. We have 3 amazing panels, including quilt making with the earth in mind, Second Lives, about reusing vintage and antique quilts in art or in clothing, which is certainly a big topic right now, and also Sustaining a Creative Business, featuring Carla Overland of Cherrywood Fabrics, a moda designer named Lisa Bonjean, Pat Sloan, quilter and YouTuber extraordinaire, all on that one panel. And we also are going to have add-on events and workshops that you can take as standalone events. So these are, you can attend either live or recorded. They include sustainable stashing with Carol Lyles Shaw, creative strength training with Jane Dunwald, freehand drawing into your quilts with Susan Chai, and yoga and self-care for quilters with Heidi Parks, Becky Goldsmith, and Carolyn Friedlander. So just a little plea that if you are interested in quilts and stories, I think it'll be a really fantastic event. And we have 2 3-day passes to give away today to QTM. I have randomly drawn 2 names of today's attendees, and they are Elizabeth Samuel and David Brantley. So Elizabeth and David will be in touch via email. Thank you so much for attending today, and let you know how you can claim your 2 free tickets. Thank you so much for attending today. I hope you'll join us for next week's talk, which is going to be presented by the Surface Design Association. It's called Future Tense Student Exhibition. Thanks again, everyone. And we'll play a little bit about our sponsors now, and we are so glad you're here. Thanks.